Hey guys, welcome back to another Default Cube CG Matter tutorial, and today we're going to talk about how to make this thing. I don't really know how to describe it, I don't know what it is, but you're going to learn how to do it today, and I'm taking this idea before Ducky3D comes up with it and makes it for himself. So the nice thing about this is you're going to learn a lot about Metaballs, a lot about procedural displacement, and you might have noticed that this thing is it's not seamless, but loopable. So where it ends is the same place it begins, and you can play this forever, and it will keep repeating and look nice. Now, of course, once it reaches the end of this timeline, it kind of looks like there's an abrupt cut, but that's because it's not a multiple of the period of this animation. Point is, it can be loopable for as long as you want. So how do we do this? Let's start a new Blender scene and I will show you. So, assuming that you haven't messed with your Blender and it's still normal, it should look like this when you start up. So what are we going to do? What we're going to do is we're actually not going to delete this cube. This is actually the core of the effect, this cube. What we're going to be doing is putting Metaballs. If you don't know what those are, I'll explain that in a bit. We're going to be putting Metaballs on each of the vertices of this cube and then just moving the cube around weirdly, which means the Metaballs are going to be interacting. That's basically the idea. There's still some shading, there's still some other stuff, but that's the core idea. So what we're going to do is Shift A to add a metaball. So metaball, and make sure it's a ball, though you can do other shapes as well. And for those of you who haven't messed with metaballs, one of the cooler features, you can just duplicate it, and you see they kind of connect like peanuts, and we can control the resolution, at least visually in this viewport display, and also in the render to make this a bit smoother. So let's go back to 1 in the center. Once you've added your metaball, we're going to have this selected, shift-click the cube, Control-P to parent to object. So now, this cube is the parent of the metaball, which is why they move together. The metaball is the child and moves with the parent. Okay, cool. So now with your parent, the cube selected, go to this tab, what's it called? Object Properties, and then go to Instancing, because we want to duplicate this metaball on each of the vertices. So for that, you choose vertices, which puts a metaball, that's why there's 8 of them, on each of the vertices, or you can do faces to get a different look. This one's kind of has more structure to it because the faces are nice and opposite to each other, whereas the verts have some diagonalness going on. Whatever, this is what we want. And the nice thing about this is if we select the child, so we go into this tree, if you want to, this relationship tree, I don't know what to call it. So parent, you pick the child, which is the metaball, you can scale it down or up, and it's going to affect all the other instances. So depending on how much connectedness you want, maybe you want them to be very isolated, then you'd make them pretty small. So something like that. And now that we have this set up, I'm also going to go back to our metaball properties and bring down the viewport resolution. This is more like a step size, so the smaller it is, the more sharp, the better it looks, is what I'm trying to say. So from 0.4 to 0.2, smooths everything out, and if we go down to 0.1, even smoother. So I'm probably going to keep both of these at 0.1, which means when we render and when we look at it in the viewport, we're going to get the same thing, which is good. Okay, so now the question is, how do we animate our cube? Because again, if we select our cube and go into edit mode, so I can select one of the vertices, which we can't see, I can move this around and it's going to move the metaball, and if it gets close enough, it connects, right? So how do we animate these vertices procedurally? There's a lot of ways to do it. Here's the best way that I've found that uses techniques I've talked about before. So with your cube selected, go to the Modifiers tab, add in a Displace Modifier, which is probably the right way to go because we were talking about displacing, so Displace Modifier, and instead of just having uniform displacement where, we do something like that, which is an effect of its own, it's fine. I don't know, that's actually pretty cool, but whatever. Instead of that, we're going to use this driven by a texture, if that's the correct way to say that. So add a new texture. We're going to call this our displacer text for displacer texture. And then in the texture tab, we can start messing around with that. Now, for what kind of texture you want here, that is up to you. Any kind of noise will work. What I recommend, and if you just want to blindly copy me, you are going to pick clouds. It's very nice. It's a very nice, smooth noise, as opposed to something like, I don't know, distorted noise is pretty chaotic, as you can see over here. So there's a whole bunch of stuff you can do, and they all give different effects. I'm going to pick clouds. And then we can even mess with it even further. So what we're looking at right here is what this texture essentially looks like, our noise. And what we can do is we can take the size and bring it up. And you can see it kind of zooms in, but effectively kind of softens everything because we're so zoomed in instead of having this chaos, right? We're very zoomed in, and that's going to make a very smooth animation here. You can also do the opposite. Okay, we can also do some more stuff here, but for now, we'll leave that as is, and we'll come back to it. So now if we go back to the Modifiers tab, this is affected by our noise, which is, it's not going to be that much different right now because it's very smoothed out, but it is working, and we can still control everything with the strength, even though it is not updating. That's fine. What we need to do now is animate our noise. Right? How do we do that? Because in our texture tab, there's no way to animate this, right? We can keyframe to size, but we just want to keyframe like the coordinates moving. So what we're going to do is a classic trick. We're going to change our texture coordinates from local to object, so they're going to be dependent on some object. And for that object, I'm going to choose a empty, and we can put that over there. So go back to here, and for our object, choose the empty. And now you can see that when we move this empty around, it's as if the thing is being animated, and really what's happening here is the texture we made, which is a 3D texture, blah, 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 is being controlled by this empty. So if I move this around, the texture moves around, which moves this displacement around. And that's the idea. That's the best way to animate procedural displacement that I found. And like I was saying before, we're getting this nice procedural animation, but they're never really getting close enough to each other. And there are a couple ways to fix that. So one is we can, what I was trying to do before, I think I was just on a bad frame or wasn't updating, whatever. We can play around with the strength. So before I was at 1, if we go to 4, that means all our displacement is going to be 4 times stronger. The magnitude's going to be bigger in either direction. So now if we animate this, it's kind of like more chaotic. Same animation, just bigger. And we can make that even more intense. If I can actually select the cube, we can make that even more intense by 6. And then you can have even crazier stuff. But what I've found, some nice settings for me is something like 3.5. Okay, cool, and you're thinking, fine, this is, that's the effect, but I feel like I don't have that much control over it. But you do, remember, this is driven by the texture. So if we go back to the texture tab with our cube, so we have this texture, we actually have a bunch of controls that give us much more choice over the kind of animation we want. So in the colors tab, you're going to see 2 things that are very important. One is brightness, and one is contrast. Brightness is how bright the texture is, so now it's basically white, and now it is basically pretty dark, right? But what does this actually do? Well, it's going to kind of preserve the animation, but it's going to say, on average, are these metaballs going to be far away or close? So we're not talking about magnitude or anything like before. Just on average, are they going to be close together or far apart? So if it's closer to 0, they're going to be, on average, closer together, even when we animate this, right? Whereas if we then do the opposite, something like here, you see that even though we have a big magnitude, they're never really reaching each other, right? So these are separate concepts is what I'm trying to say. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep them kind of closer than the default, which is 1. So let's try to keep them at a distance of like 0.8 or something. Maybe that's too close, maybe like 0.9. Okay, cool. So that's one thing, and that animates nicely. So now we have them in the proximity we want. But what about the behavior, right? How chaotic are these going to be? And we can either determine that by how fast we animate this, but also, given that this is the same, how do we have even more control over that? Well, that is where contrast comes in, and you can think of this as, well, let's show you. Contrast goes up. Basically, the contrast of the texture goes up. Well, what does the fall off look like between a white and a black portion? So when we have a very high contrast, you can see it's very chaotic and they have a lot of velocity when they're moving. Whereas if we do the opposite, they're eventually, once we get to 0, they're not even going to move, but at something like 0.1, they're going to be very slow. Right, so the first one is just general proximity. The second one is power, velocity, whatever you want to call it. A physicist would not say power, though. That is for sure. So I'm going to go with something that's pretty close, but a bit more chaotic. So instead of 1, I'm going to go with something like 1.4 or something. Play around with this. By the way, when we play the timeline, nothing's going to happen because, again, dependent on the empty. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with this, and let's say that we want to turn this into an animation. Bunch of ways we can do that. We can either take this empty, put a keyframe, I'm hitting I. Put a keyframe for location, go to the last frame, frame 250 in this case. Let's do 100 frames so that it's not as much. So 100 frames, you put it somewhere else, keyframe the location, take the interpolation, that's T, make it linear so it's not doing anything weird in between. Everything's constant speed in terms of this animation. And there you go. You have a very cool animation. The faster you animate this, the more chaotic it will be. So if we instead put it here, location, now you can see that everything feels like it's going faster. But there are some issues with this. One, I don't really want to be moving around my empty. And second of all, there's nothing really loopable about this, right? It's not like I can have this keep on going forever unless I just animate this going up forever, which is not what I want to do. So these are things we need to address. So I'm going to go back to 250 actually, because I like the long timeline for what I'm about to show you. So here comes the next trick. What we're going to do is we're going to select our cube and hit N to get these transform properties. Make sure you're an item. And we're just going to have this rotate. And you're thinking, okay, what does it matter if it's spinning? I will show you. So let's add a keyframe here for rotation. And then on the last frame, we're going to have this do one full revolution. So 360 degrees or negative 360 degrees if you want the other orientation. And remember, this is going to be on a Bezier interpolation, which is why it's slow and then speeds up. And then towards the end, it's going to slow down. So I'm going to set this to linear. And now we have this rotating thing. But wait a second, don't take this for granted. The metaballs are moving, which means that just because it's rotating and this empty isn't even moving, somehow everything still works. And the reason this is actually working is because our texture coordinates are set to object, meaning it's dependent on this empty, but in reference to the cube. So when it's rotating, it's effectively seeing the empty from a different orientation, if you want to think about it that way. So it's not really just about the empty, it's about the empty's relationship to this cube. So if I move the cube, that's another way to animate this, is what I'm trying to say. So really, you want to think about the distance in between these and the orientation between these. So even though this is still, we can rotate our cube and get, the same results. And the nice thing about this, why does it matter? Notice what this looks like on the first frame. Now I'm going to go to the last frame. Do you notice that nothing is changing? That means because it's rotated and gone back to its original orientation, it's gone back to the same part of the animation, which means it is loopable now. Loopable. So if I play this and maybe make it a higher frame rate so it burns through it faster, you'll see. Notice what happens when we get to the end of the timeline. Wait for it. It just keeps going. Now, ideally, you go only to frame 249 so you don't have a repeat frame because the last frame and the first frame are the same. So now this will look even smoother once we get there. There you go. We've made a loopable animation. So now we just need to take care of some of the extra details. So first of all, if we go to the camera view, this is, where we'd render it from. So again, we talked about brightness, contrast, displacement strength. Forget about it, right? Let's say this is the animation you want. Some extra details. One, I don't want to see this cube. I just want to see the metaballs. What you're going to do to fix that is you're going to select your parent. That's the cube. You're going to go back to object properties and in this instancing, which again is where we did the magic. And again, we can always change this to faces. And this will give us a different result using the same stuff. But I'm going to go back to vertices. What we're going to do is we're going to disable these. So display instancer, I don't want to see it. And render instancer, I don't want it to render once we actually hit render, and that will make it disappear. Now another thing to note, I'm pretty sure that this is technically not 8 metaballs, perhaps it's 9 if you include the original instance, but whatever, that doesn't matter. So that's the first thing. The second thing is if we go to rendered mode, it already looks pretty cool. I mean, we didn't do any fancy lighting or anything, but maybe we want a bit of shading. To do that, go to the shading workspace. We're not going to be doing anything fancy here. We're just going to take a noise texture, and this is already by default using generated coordinates, as you can see, so that's fine. Take this noise texture. I'm going to use the factor, put it into base color, and that is not updating. Why? Think about it. It's because I applied it to the cube. So even though these are attached to the cube in some sense, we need to put a material on the instance. So even though we made this material, which I'm going to call meta for metaball, all we have to do is just select our metaball. So select it and then apply the same material. So took a couple extra clicks, but it's fine. Okay, so now we have our noise there, and we could do a couple things to this. So we can change the scale. I'm going to keep this very small, actually, which is to say a small number, but very big on the Metaballs. Maximum detail, maybe a tiny bit of distortion, even though, actually, that does look cool. There you go. And the nice thing about Metaballs is since they're moving through space and they're like generated coordinates as a unit, as all of them combined is consistently changing, there's always this nice flowing to it that's kind of like continuously changing. And we can make this a bit sharper with a color ramp node. This stuff is kind of like the part that doesn't matter. It's just, the stylistic stuff. But it does look pretty neat. And I'm trying to think, is there anything else that you guys would want to know about this? Metaballs have been known to be a bit strange with motion blur, especially with Eevee, so that's something to watch out for. But I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I feel like we went over a lot of theory rather than application, but this is the application, and the nice thing about this is you don't have to use a cube. You can use a monkey and have, hundreds of Metaballs doing their thing. And again, at any point you can change anything about this. You can always go back to the texture. I'm going to select my cube. You can always go back to the texture and just change the size. So this is going to make it feel more chaotic, right? Because the noise is much finer. Or we can go back up here. We can change the average distance so they're further apart or closer together. And the contrast for their behavior. So more chaotic or more kind of passive. And of course, we can do some stuff with the displacement modifier. And finally, before I close this tutorial, we still have control over the Metaballs. So if we wanted this to be lower resolution, we can always do that. Maybe that's what you're going for, or maybe your computer's like, chugging along. And I haven't tested this before, but if you go into edit mode, so I'm hitting tab on the Metaball, I'm sure you could do some weird stuff with negative, but I guess if they're all negative, it's pretty weird. Whatever. Point is, you can still go into edit mode and it will affect all of these. So hopefully you enjoyed this tutorial. Remember, takeaway is everything we learned, and this thing is loopable. So feel free to make a seamless, continuous animation, whatever Ducky calls it. No idea. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, the best way to support me, it's not by liking, it's not by subscribing, it is by donating over to my Patreon, and it's technically a donation, but you are also getting access to Discord stuff that isn't available to others. You're getting access to some exclusive tutorials, and for sure you're getting access to a bunch of early content. I drop a couple spoilers about what I'm working on. So if that is something you're interested in, or you just want to help support these tutorials and keep them funded, that is the best way to do it, and I appreciate all my patrons and all future patrons. And yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this free tutorial. Thank you for watching.